Tonight we follow the immortal king who swallowed his own children to hold a throne no god could keep forever. Before you settle in, take a moment to subscribe, but only if these stories genuinely bring you peace. Long before the Olympians raised their palaces on the high slopes of Olympus, before Zeus drew lightning from the clouds, or Poseidon drove his chariot across the deep, there was a time when the world itself was still learning what it was. A time without cities, without seasons as we know them, without the careful ordering of sky and sea and stone. There was only what had always been from the very first moment of existence. Outranos above, vast and blue and infinite. Gaia below, dark and warm and endlessly patient. In the beginning, there was no separation between them. Outranos pressed himself close against Gaia without rest. His body was the sky, his breath the wind, his presence everywhere at once. Gaia bore this closeness the way the earth bears everything, silently, with deep roots and deeper suffering, for within her body children had begun to stir, children of enormous power and ancient blood, the Titans, 12 of them in all, sons and daughters born from the union of sky and earth. Their names were spoken in the early world like the first words of a language still being formed. Oceanus, who would become the great encircling river at the edge of all things, Coas and Creus, Hyperion, who carried the memory of light, Iapetus, whose sons would one day shape the fate of mortal creatures, and Thea, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, and Tethys, goddesses of enormous depth and grace, 12 children altogether. 12 immortal presences waiting within the body of their mother, but Outranos would not let them come forth. He was afraid of them, or perhaps only possessive of his position, or perhaps something between the two that gods rarely admit to feeling. Whatever his reasoning, he pressed his children back into Gaia's depths each time they tried to emerge. He kept them bound beneath the surface, in the warm dark below the world, neither free nor entirely absent. Gaia felt each of them moving within her, felt their strength and their restlessness and their confusion. She endured it, the way mountains endure erosion, for a very long time. The youngest of the 12 was named Kronos. He was called the most cunning of the Titans, and this was not said carelessly. Kronos possessed a quality that none of his brothers shared, a kind of watchful patience combined with willingness to act when the moment arrived. He listened more than he spoke. He observed the pattern of his father's movements, the rhythm of Outranos pressing down against his mother, the way the sky sealed itself over the earth like a lid over a jar. He noted these things and stored them. Gaia, in those long ages of suffering, was not idle in her thinking. She understood what Outranos was. She understood that his fear of displacement had become a cruelty, that keeping 12 immortal children locked within her body was not merely an act of selfishness, but a kind of violence done against the natural order. Something needed to change. She turned this over in her vast, unhurried mind for longer than human imagination can easily hold. She began, at some point in the deep, unrecorded past, to work with her hands, or with whatever the earth uses in place of hands. She fashioned from the hardest substance she knew a tool unlike anything that had yet existed in the world, an adamantine sickle, grey and cold and absolutely final in its sharpness. It was not made carelessly. It was made with the slow, deliberate patience of someone who has waited a very long time and intends not to waste the act when it comes. Then she approached her children. One by one, in the darkness where they were kept, she laid out what she wished them to do. The request was not a small one. She was asking her children to act against their father, the sky himself, the first king, the origin of their existence. Most of them pulled back from it. Oceanus would not commit himself. The others listened and fell silent in the way that immortals fall silent when they are afraid, but do not wish to say so plainly. One by one they refused her. Kronos did not refuse. He reached out his hand for the sickle and took it from his mother. Whatever he felt in that moment, the old accounts do not linger on it. Whether he acted from a desire to help Gaia or from an ambition of his own is a question the myths leave open. Perhaps both were true at once. Perhaps he simply saw that the thing needed doing and that no one else would do it. Gaia held the knowledge of what was about to change. The world held its breath in the way that worlds do before their arrangements are broken and remade. Ouranos descended toward Gaia as he always did, as night followed whatever came before night, as the sky lowers itself toward the earth in the long hours of darkness. He did not see what waited for him. Kronos moved from his concealment with the sickle in his grip, and the blow was delivered in one swift and irreversible motion. The sky recoiled. The wound was done. Ouranos pulled himself away from Gaia with a sound the world had never produced before and would never quite produce again. His blood fell onto the earth below, and from those dark drops shapes began to form slowly over the ages that followed. The Erinyes, ancient goddesses of retribution, emerged from where his blood soaked into the soil. The giants rose from the same source, vast and powerful and carrying within them the anger of that original wound. The severed parts were cast into the sea. The waters received them. From the foam that gathered and dispersed and gathered again around that offering, something entirely unexpected came forth. Drifting toward the shores of Cyprus on a swell of pale sea foam, luminous and bewildered and new, Aphrodite stepped from the water into a world she had not been planned for. Born from an act of violence, she nonetheless carried in her face and form the kind of beauty that makes the mind go very still and quiet. Ouranos retreated into the upper reaches of the sky. His reign over Gaia's body was finished. The 12 children, all 12 of them, came freely into the world at last. The earth opened, and the Titans emerged, tall and ancient and blinking at the light of a sky that no longer pressed against them. Gaia breathed, and Kronos stood at the center of all of it, the adamantine sickle still in his hand. The youngest of the 12, now the most powerful of them all. The cosmos waited to learn what kind of king he would be. The story was only beginning. Gaia did not celebrate. She lay still in the long aftermath, feeling the sky draw away from her. Feeling the space where Ouranos had always pressed down, now empty and open. The air that moved across her surface was different. Cooler. She breathed it in and out and did not speak for a long time. Kronos set the sickle down somewhere near her. The grey blade rested against the dark soil. Cold and finished and quiet, he stood in the open world and looked around at it. The other Titans stood nearby, some closer, some further off, each one taking in the strangeness of having room, of not being held. Coeus turned his face upward. Rhea spread his arms slowly, as though testing whether the sky would descend again and stop him. It did not. Hyperion moved toward the horizon, wherever that was, unhurried and immense. Iapetus watched Kronos without moving. They were all free. But freedom is a large thing when you have never had it. It takes some time to fill. Gaia spoke to Kronos first among all of them. She spoke quietly, the way the ground speaks when it settles after long stillness. She said something to this effect. You have done what none of your brothers would do. You have freed us. Whatever you carry forward from this day, you carry it as the one who acted. Kronos heard this without visible response. He had always been that way, receiving things inwardly, processing them at his own pace, in his own way, before returning anything to the surface. But he sat down beside her. That much was clear in the old accounts. He did not immediately walk away toward power or dominion. He sat with his mother in the open air that she had not breathed freely in longer than either of them could well account for. The other Titans drifted apart, exploring in their various directions. Kronos stayed. It would be too simple to call this tenderness, and too simple to call it strategy. It was perhaps something that existed before either of those words had meaning. The youngest child staying close to his mother after an act of enormous consequence. Gaia in her vast and patient way, letting him sit there, neither of them speaking much. The cosmos was very quiet in those hours, or whatever corresponded to hours in that early time. The sky remained high and distant. Auranos gone into his upper cold. The earth's surface was open to whatever light came from wherever light came from. The Titans moved across it like the first long shadows, large and unhurried. Gaia eventually told Kronos what she thought he should know. She told him that ruling was not the same as overthrowing, that holding power was different from taking it, that the thing he had done was not an ending but a beginning, and that beginnings carry within them the seeds of everything that follows. She spoke without urgency. She spoke the way old things speak, as though the words themselves had been forming for centuries before she said them aloud. Kronos listened. He was good at listening. It was perhaps his truest quality. She also told him, though not yet with the full force of prophecy, that the shape of what he had done would be recognized by the cosmos, that patterns established in the founding moments of the world tend to repeat themselves. She did not say this to frighten him. She said it because she was the earth, and the earth knows how things grow, and she had watched long enough to understand that history is not a line but a wheel. Whether Kronos truly heard that second part is unclear. He heard the words. Understanding and hearing are not always the same thing. In those early days after the overthrow, there was something genuine between them. Between Gaia and the son who had agreed to act when no other would. She looked at him with whatever the earth uses for looking. He returned it with that watchful, measuring attention that had always been his. They were bound by what they had done together, by the sickle she had made and the hand that had swung it. There was warmth in that of a kind. The warmth of shared consequence. His siblings gathered back to him gradually. Caius and Phoebe, who had paired together in the world's first dawning. Oceanus and Tethys, enormous and slow-moving, already turning toward the great rivers they would become. Hyperion with his luminous quality, his constant reaching toward the brightest distance. Themis, who carried within her a sense of balance so strong it registered as a kind of gravity. Mnemosyne, who remembered everything, including things that had not yet happened. Rhea. Rhea came to stand beside Kronos when the others had found their directions and wandered toward them. She was his sister. She was also something more particular than that. In the way the old world worked, similarity recognized similarity. Rhea shared with Kronos a quality that the others did not. She was patient in the same register. Observant, not as cunning perhaps, but capable of stillness in the face of loud confusion. They did not speak at first. She looked at where the sickle lay against the ground. Then she looked at him. He did not explain himself. He did not need to. She had seen it all from inside the same dark space he had occupied for those long unremembered ages. She knew what had been at stake. She knew what it had cost. She picked up the sickle. Not to keep it, just to hold it for a moment. She turned it in her hands, felt the grey cold of the blade, set it back down with some care. Between them, standing there in the first open air, something settled. Not declared, not named. Just understood, the way that large quiet things are understood when two minds are the same order of patient. Gaia watched them from below. She was made of all of it after all, the joy of freedom and the shadow already beginning to form at the base of it. She loved Kronos, that was not in doubt. She also knew what she knew. She was the earth. She knew how roots grow, and she knew what happens when a thing that has been held too tightly is finally released. She did not say this yet. There would be time, for now the Titans stood in their new world. The sky above them was open and cold and immensely far away. Ouranos, somewhere in that cold distance, retreating but not gone. Watching, perhaps, or simply existing in the way that wounded things exist. Present but diminished, changed by what had been done and unable to change it back. and Kronos stood among his siblings, sickle nearby, Rhea beside him, his mother's approval still warm in the air around him, the youngest of the 12. The one who had acted. He did not yet know what he was building. He did not yet know what he would become, but the wheel had turned once, and the cosmos held the shape of it. Somewhere deep in the structure of things, in the long unnoticed logic of how the world operates, a pattern had been established. A father overcome by his youngest son, power transferred through an act of irreversible consequence. The wheel does not always announce itself, it simply turns. And in the stillness of that early world, with the sickle cold against the dark soil and Gaia breathing her long, slow breath beneath them all, the first repetition had already begun. The night Uranos fell, the sky did not collapse, it simply withdrew. That was the strange quality of it. Kronos had expected something more absolute. A tearing, a silence so complete it would press against the ears. Instead, Uranos receded the way water recedes from a shore after a wave has broken. He was there, and then he was further away, and then further still. Present in the cold, high distance, diminished, altered beyond return. Kronos stood on the dark soil and felt the open air above him for the first time as something permanent. Not a temporary loosening, a new condition of the world. He did not celebrate this. It did not feel like a thing that wanted celebration. What he had done lived in his hands, not as pain. The Titans did not suffer from their acts the way mortals would later suffer, but there was a quality to his hands that had changed. The weight of the sickle was no longer in them, yet his grip had not entirely released. Some part of him was still holding on. Some part of him always would be. He set the sickle aside with deliberate care. Rhea watched him do it. She noted the deliberateness. She did not comment on it. That was her quality, among the finest of them. She knew when silence was the appropriate response, from the place where the sickle had first swung outward, where Kronos had stood in the dark and waited for Uranos to come close enough. The ground still held the memory of the act. The dark soil was darkened further in places. Not with blood exactly, with something older than blood, with consequence, and from that consequence things were already rising. Kronos watched them come. He could not have described what they were, not yet. The world did not yet have the words for what was being born from the edges of what he had done, but he could see them forming at the far edge of his sight. 3 figures, vast and purposeful, moving the way newly arrived things move, as though testing the ground beneath them, learning the weight of existence as they stepped. The Erinyes. He knew them for what they were without being told. Gaia knew them too from below. She did not flinch from them. She had made the sickle, knowing they would come. She had given Kronos the blade with full understanding that what he severed would not simply fall away cleanly, that there would be continuation from the wound. These 3 had been waiting inside the violence all along, coiled in the future of the act, the way seeds are coiled inside their coverings. Now the covering was broken. They moved across the open world with absolute certainty. They did not look at Kronos with anything recognizable as anger. Their attention was larger than that. They were not directed at him specifically. They were directed at the category of act he had performed. They carried within them the weight of all such acts, not just his, but every wrong done to a parent, every blood tie severed, every bound obligation broken by someone who told themselves necessity required it. Kronos did not run from them. He was Kronos. He stood and observed them as they moved away across the dark terrain, but he had felt something when they passed. A coolness that was not the air, a sense of being measured. From the sea, something else. The severed portion of Uranos had struck the water, and the sea had received it, the way the sea receives all things. Aye, without judgment, with vast, slow incorporation, the foam had gathered, had turned, had built itself upward with a patient inevitability that had nothing hurried in it and nothing stopped. and from the foam there came a figure whose arrival was the opposite of the Erinyes in every quality. Where they had been purposeful, she was luminous. Where they had carried cold weight, she moved with the ease of something that had never known resistance. She arrived on the dark shore with her face turned upward, and even in that early world with no sun yet placed in the sky, she seemed lit from within by something the cosmos had not previously contained. Aphrodite. Kronos looked at her. She did not look at him. Her attention was already elsewhere, already pulling outward toward whatever called to beauty in the world. She would not remember him. She would not need to. She had not come from his act so much as from the space his act had opened. She was the other side of the coin that bore the Erinyes on its face, both born from the same moment. Consequence and beauty, reckoning and grace. The cosmos did not distribute its reactions evenly. It never had. It gave back what had been given, but transformed, sorted into categories only the earth could fully read. Gaia read them. She felt Aphrodite's first steps on the shore, the way she felt all first steps. The giants too were rising somewhere beyond the horizon of this moment, born from blood dropped to earth, large and eventual. Kronos did not see them yet. They would come in their own time. Everything came in its own time. He looked at Rhea. She was watching the place where Aphrodite had arrived and was now departing, moving away along the edge of the water with that unhurried, luminous ease. Rhea's expression carried nothing sharp, nothing afraid. She was processing, sitting with the full complicated reality of what one act could generate. He understood then, standing there, that what he had done was not finished. It had never been finished from the moment Gaia pressed the sickle into his hands. Acts of that order do not complete themselves. They open. They keep opening. They send things out into the world that walk and breathe and operate on their own authority, carrying the original moment inside them, like a stone carried in deep water. Rhea turned from the shore and looked at him. He had no words. She did not require any. The sickle lay on the dark soil between them, cold and grey and done. Above them, Ouranos was somewhere in the high distance, still there, still watching, or still existing, which, in his current state, amounted to the same thing, still carrying the wound that would not close. Still the sky, but a sky that had been made to understand its own limits. Kronos had given him that understanding. He had not asked for the task. He had simply been the one willing to do it. And here, in the steady quiet that followed, standing on the earth his mother made while the Erinyes walked their circuit, and Aphrodite moved toward the sea's far edge, Kronos felt the shape of what he had become. Not the liberator, not the conqueror. Something more specific and less comfortable than either, the one who had acted, the one who had picked up the blade, the one from whose hands the wheel had turned once already with the cold, deliberate permanence of first things. The cosmos held his name now in a particular way. The soil beneath his feet held the record of the act. Gaia, slow and certain beneath him, held everything, and the sickle on the ground held its silence. Rhea was the one who moved first. She walked toward the sickle and stood over it without touching it, looking down at the grey adamantine in the dark soil. Her posture was not ceremonial. It was something quieter than that, the posture of someone taking stock of an object that has already done everything it was made to do. Then she lifted her eyes to the open world beyond the shore, to the wide, dark expanse of it, to the sky that was now Ouranos, reduced and distant, to the sea moving in its slow repetition, to all that open, unruled space that had not existed in any practical sense until tonight. She breathed it in. Kronos watched her do this. He watched the way her shoulders settled slightly, the way she turned her face very gradually toward the air coming off the water. There was something in her that was receiving this new world, the way soil receives rain. Not with urgency, with simple readiness. He had not expected that. He had expected many possible responses from her. He had not expected ease. She spoke then, without turning toward him. Her voice was level, not cold, not warm, simply present, the way the ground was present beneath their feet. She said, "The Titans will need to know," not the Titans needed to be told. Not we should go to them. She had already reduced it to its practical form. What required doing? He answered, "I know." She turned then and looked at him directly. Her face in that early darkness held no accusation. It held the look of someone who had arrived at a particular understanding through very different paths than the one she expected to walk. She studied him for a moment with that contained attention he had noticed in her long before any of this, before Gaia had called them together, before the sickle was even a thought spoken aloud. Then she nodded once, slowly, and walked past the sickle and away from the shore toward the inland darkness. Not hurried, simply moving as one moves when the next thing is clear. Kronos remained a moment longer. Then he followed. They walked together through the early world without speaking further. The Titans were scattered across the vast terrain, each occupying some portion of the cosmos they had been born into and never quite permitted to shape. Oceanos by the river that circled the world. Hyperion near the bright regions that would eventually hold the sun's path. Themis and Mnemosyne in the quieter places, attending to the ordering principles that had existed even before Ouranos fell. Kronos and Rhea moved among them. The word passed from one to the next without drama. Ouranos had fallen. The sky had withdrawn. The world was open. Each Titan received this differently. Some stood very still for a long time. Some looked upward to confirm it. Some looked at Kronos with an expression that was difficult to read, containing some blend of gratitude and unease, the combination that attaches itself to someone who has done what others only thought. Rhea moved beside him through all of it. She did not speak on his behalf. She did not interpret him or excuse him. She was simply present, steadily, and that steadiness was its own kind of statement. It was Themis who said what several of the others were turning over in their thoughts. She looked at Kronos and said, "The world will need to be held now. Someone must hold it. He did not seek it." That was the truth he would carry, or the truth he told himself, and the distinction between those two things would only clarify itself much later. He had not stood over his father's body and reached for authority. Authority had simply come to rest in him the way it rests in whoever made the last irrevocable move. He had been the one. So now he was the one. He looked at Rhea. She met his gaze. There was no ceremony spoken, no formal conferring. It settled between them with the quiet mutual recognition of two people who already know what the next passage of their existence will require. He would rule what Ouranos had held, and she would stand beside it. They built nothing elaborate. The early world did not require elaborate structures. There was the open sky above, the earth below, the sea at its margins, and the understanding among the Titans that Kronos now occupied the center of the pattern. And the world Kronos and Rhea moved through in those long first passages was genuinely, quietly beautiful. The Golden Age came not as a decree. It came as a condition, as a quality the world took on when something oppressive was lifted from it, and the beings that had been waiting simply began to be what they were. Humanity was stirring somewhere in the softer regions of the earth, fragile and new and knowing very little. They lived in the open air. They gathered what they needed without difficulty. The earth gave generously in those early passages. Rhea observed this. She paid attention to the small arrangements of the world. A hillside in late warmth, the slow drift of water across stone, the way some particular light settled on open ground in the long quiet periods between dark and dark. She brought these observations to Kronos, not as reports, as gifts offered without agenda. She would say simply, "Come and look at this," and lead him to some small perfection the world had made without assistance. He found himself, in those passages, less occupied with the structure of ruling than with the texture of standing beside her. The Golden Age unfolded around them without requiring their management. It simply was. And in that long, untroubled middle period, before anything had arrived to complicate it, the bond between them grew the way things grow when given adequate quiet and no disruption. Slowly, without announcing itself, putting down roots into a ground that would eventually be tested, Rhea had a steadiness that was its own form of warmth. It was not demonstrative. She did not offer easy comfort or quick reassurance. But when she was present, her presence was complete. She gave her attention without reservation. Kronos had known many things in his existence. He had known Gaia's ancient certainty and Uranos's oppressive weight and the cold, purposeful passing of the Erinyes. He had known what it was to hold adamantine and to use it. He had known the particular quality of the moment after an irrevocable act. What he had not known until Rhea was what it felt like to be fully, ordinarily seen, not assessed, not used, not feared, simply known. She knew that he was not only what he had done. She knew the part of him that had stood in the dark world and felt the magnitude of the Erinyes' passing with something very close to grief. The part that had looked at Aphrodite's departure with a recognition he could not name. She had seen that part of him from the first night, and she had not turned away from it, and she had not made anything more of it than it was. She simply knew it was there. And he held her knowing carefully, the way one holds the only object that has not yet acquired the weight of consequence. The sickle they had left on the dark shore, neither of them had gone back for it. It lay there in the soil, cooling, grey and finished, somewhere behind the long passage of those early harmonious ages, behind the warmth of the Golden Age and the ease of humanity and the quiet Titan world arranging itself into something that would hold. Behind all of that lay the grey blade in the dark ground, waiting with the patience that only objects with no expectations can manage, and the world breathed around them, wide and open and temporarily untroubled. And Kronos, standing beside Rhea on some quiet hillside, with the long cool air moving over the ancient earth, allowed himself to believe, briefly, that the opening was finished, that what had been set in motion had reached its resting place. Gaia, far below, knew otherwise, but she did not say so yet. Gaia did not speak in words. She had never needed to. Her communications arrived through older channels, a particular settling of the ground beneath a foot placed on open soil, a temperature shift in the deep earth, not dramatic, not sudden, but enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention. Kronos was paying attention. He had always paid attention to Gaia. From the first dark passage of his existence, pressing against her walls, unborn and waiting, he had understood that she communicated in pressures and silences rather than speech. The ambush had been one such communication. She had not shouted her instructions. She had handed him the sickle and let the weight of it speak. Now, in the long warmth of the Golden Age, she was speaking again. He noticed it first as a change in the quality of the ground. Standing on a hillside with Rhea one late quiet afternoon, the soil beneath his feet had a different density than the passages before, a heaviness that had nothing to do with the earth's ordinary weight. He stood very still. Rhea was looking at something in the middle distance, a slow fold of land where pale grasses bent in a low wind. He did not tell her what he felt. He told himself it was nothing particular. But he noted it, filed it away in the part of him that tracked such things. The second communication came through Ouranos. This was unexpected. Ouranos had withdrawn so completely after the dark shore that Kronos had stopped thinking of him as a presence. He was simply the sky now, vast and pale and far, emptied of his previous oppressive closeness, reduced to something ambient and unreachable. But one morning, before Hyperion had properly begun his passage, the sky did something unusual. It bruised, not storm, not any atmospheric disruption the young Titans had yet seen. It was a bruising at the horizon, deep violet with copper underneath, moving with a slowness that was nothing like weather. It held. Then it faded. It left behind a stillness that hummed. Kronos stood alone in that particular stillness and heard, not with his ears, a voice he recognized as his father's. Not words in any deliberate arrangement, not a sentence. More, the resonance of intention, the shape of something that had been decided long before it was spoken. What arrived in him was this: you are not finished. No elaboration, no context given. That alone, settling into him with the patient finality of something that has been waiting for the right moment to arrive. He turned away from the horizon, walked back toward where Rhea was tending to some small observation of her own, a pale flower that had opened in a crack of stone, unremarkable to anyone who did not look carefully. He did not tell her what the sky had communicated. He told himself he was not certain it had communicated anything. Gaia came the third time more directly. She came as a dream, though calling it a dream is not quite accurate. It arrived during a long period of rest, in that space that is not sleep, but not full wakefulness either, the place where the edges of one's ordinary certainty become permeable. In that space, Gaia appeared to him as she sometimes did, ancient, unhurried, her face, the face of someone who has never needed to rush because time belongs to her more completely than it belongs to anyone else. She looked at Kronos the way she had looked at him before handing him the sickle, not with affection, not with cruelty, with the steady, depthless regard of someone who can see the full shape of a thing before it has finished becoming itself. She did not speak at first. She simply regarded him. Then she said, in the pared-down way she always delivered what mattered, what you did to him, one of yours will do to you. She said it without inflection, without judgment, without anything that could be called satisfaction. It arrived as a simple notation, a fact being placed on a shelf where it would sit until the shelf became relevant. Kronos woke from the not dream with the stillness of someone who has received news that was not surprising but is still in the receiving, very heavy. He lay in the quiet air. He looked at the open sky above. The sky was pale and unmarked. Hyperion had begun his arc. The morning had the ordinary quality of mornings in the Golden Age, soft and generous, and apparently without shadow. Rhea slept beside him. He could hear the calm of her. He did not wake her. He held the words in his mind and turned them in the way one turns an object in the hands, slowly, examining every surface, trying to determine what exactly one is holding, what you did to him. One of yours. The repetition was not lost on him. He understood cycles. He had been born inside one, pressed against his mother's interior, while his father kept him in. He had broken that cycle with adamantine. He had believed, in the breaking, that the cycle was finished. Now his ancient mother sat in her not-dream place and told him it was simply rotating. He rose before Rhea woke, walked out to where the land opened onto a long plain, still cool, the grasses silvered by early light. Humanity was visible somewhere below, small and unhurried, gathering what the earth offered. They did not know what was being arranged above them. Their ease was complete. Their days were full of exactly what was needed, and nothing that required more than what they had. Kronos watched them for a while. There was something in their smallness that he found, in that particular morning, almost unbearable to look at. Not with contempt, something closer to its opposite. They lived so entirely within their moment, nothing behind them except yesterday's ease, nothing ahead except tomorrow's provision. He looked at his own hands, held them out in the morning light. They looked the way they always looked. They did not announce what they had carried. The bruised horizon was gone. The sky was clean. but the words were still sitting on the internal shelf where Gaia had placed them. He walked back to where Rhea would be waking. He watched her open her eyes in the unhurried way she always did, taking in the morning without urgency, locating herself in the day with steady, quiet competence. She looked at him. Something in his face must have shifted in the night, some small rearrangement of the ordinary. She said, "Simply, you look as though you have been somewhere." He considered this. He said, "I stayed here." She accepted this in the way she accepted most things, without pressing further. She turned her attention to the morning's arrangements, the small practical matters of the early day, and Kronos moved through the rest of that morning carrying something new. Not panic, not yet. Something quieter and more durable than panic, a low, attentive pressure behind every ordinary moment. The sense of standing in the last passage of something without knowing precisely when that passage would conclude. The golden age continued around him, unchanged. The earth gave generously. Humanity gathered without difficulty. And somewhere below, in the ancient dark soil of the world's deepest places, Gaia turned over her long, slow knowing, patient and unhurried, waiting, as she always waited, for the conditions she had already foreseen to finish assembling themselves. Time moved in the way it moved during the Golden Age, without urgency, without the sense of anything pressing toward a conclusion. Rhea first carried a child through an autumn that was generous and unhurried. The trees gave fruit without effort. The grasses on the long plain deepened their color and then released it, gold into gold, and the world below continued its ease without interruption. She moved through those months with the particular calm she always carried, steady in her body, steady in her attention, turning each day over with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Kronos watched her. He watched her the way he had watched his own hands in the morning light after Gaia's words had settled into him, looking for something he could not name, some confirmation or refutation of what had been placed on that internal shelf and had not moved since. He found neither. He found only Rhea moving through her days. Niscient, present, turning her face to each morning with an openness he had always admired without knowing precisely how to name his admiration. Hestia arrived in the deep quiet of a winter night. Kronos held her first. That was how it was in those first days after Gaia's warning had settled in him, before the pressure hardened into decision. He held her, and she was small and complete, and her eyes moved without focusing, the way newborn eyes do, taking in light without yet knowing what light was. Rhea lay beside him, exhausted and calm in the aftermath of labor, her hair spread across the cloth beneath her. Her breathing had slowed to something deep and measured. She watched him hold Hestia with an expression he had seen before, open and full, and turned entirely toward the two of them. He looked down at the child in his arms. He looked at Rhea. The prophecy sat on its shelf and said nothing. For 7 days. Hestia slept in the chambers where Kronos and Rhea slept. Rhea nursed her in the early hours, humming something without melody, just a low sustained sound that seemed to come from somewhere beneath thought. Kronos sat with them in those quiet morning hours more than Rhea expected. He said little. He had always said little, but his presence had a quality during those days that she noticed without commenting on. Attentive, slightly held back, like someone sitting at the edge of warmth without moving fully into it. She noticed. She did not speak of it. On the 8th day, Kronos took Hestia from the room where she slept. He told Rhea afterward that it was done. He told her plainly, with the flat delivery of someone who has rehearsed the sentence and found no version of it that softens the content. He said it was necessary. He said the prophecy allowed no other arrangement. Rhea did not speak immediately. She stood very still, her hands at her sides, her face turned slightly away from him toward the open doorway where the morning came through in a bar of pale light. Then she said, in a voice that was quiet and entirely controlled, which prophecy? He told her then. the words that Uranus had delivered in his wounding, the words Gaia had placed in the not dream, one of yours. He gave her the plain shape of it, without embellishment, without the turns of consideration he had spent months working through alone. She listened. When he finished, she turned her face toward him. Her expression had not broken into grief. Not yet. What was there instead was something harder and quieter than grief. The look of someone receiving information that reshapes everything behind it, every previous understanding, adjusting itself around this new central fact. She said, "You could have told me this before." He said, "I know." That was all that passed between them on the subject. In those first days, the silence that followed was not angry. It was the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a thing that has been done and cannot be undone, measuring the distance across it. Demeter came the following spring. The world was especially green that year. The plain below lay in deep colour, and the earth produced with an abundance that seemed to ask nothing in return for its generosity. Rhea laboured again in the same chambers. The same deep quiet. The same early morning hours with a newborn's soundless breathing in the room. This time Rhea did not hand the child over easily. She held Demeter for longer than was perhaps wise. She held her through the first night and the second. Kronos sat with her in those vigils, and there was between them the particular intimacy of two people who know a thing is coming and cannot stop it, and have run out of words that address the gap between what is and what they would prefer. On the third morning, Rhea handed Demeter to him without speaking. Her hands let go with a steadiness that cost her more than her face showed. Kronos understood this. He understood it fully, and the understanding did not make it easier for either of them. He left the room. When he returned, Rhea was sitting with her back very straight, looking at the place where the morning light reached the floor. She did not look up when he came in. She did not ask if it was done. She already knew. There was a long period of silence after that. Not the silence of withdrawal, but of two people existing in the same space around a grief that had no adequate shape yet. Kronos sat beside her. He did not reach for her hand. She did not reach for his. But they remained there together in the pale morning, neither departing, the space between them holding what neither could find the right way to carry. Hera came in the autumn again. By then, the quality of silence between them had changed. It had moved from the raw, adjusting silence of early loss into something more worn, more permanently settled into the structure of their days. Rhea received each morning with the same external steadiness. She was not diminished. She was altered. There is a difference, and the difference was visible in how she held herself. The openness that had characterized her face in the early days of the Golden Age had not disappeared, but there was something behind it now, a depth, a knowledge that had not been there before. She handed Hera over on the first day. She did it without the long vigil she had allowed herself with Demeter. She had apparently decided, in whatever private arrangements she made with herself, that the longer vigil did not change the outcome and only extended the moment of severance. Kronos took the child from her arms. And what he noticed in that transfer was how carefully Rhea composed her hands as they released. There was a practiced quality to the steadiness that undid him more than open grief would have. She had learned, in the space of two losses, how to hold herself through a third. He left. He came back. She was standing at the open window, her back to the room, looking out at the autumn plain with its long grasses going to rust and copper in the cooling light. He stood in the doorway. She did not turn around. He said nothing. She said nothing. Outside, the plain lay generous and golden under Hyperion's afternoon arc. The world gave its abundance freely, as it had always given since the Golden Age began. And between them, in the quiet room, the bronze of aftermath settled. Hades came in the winter of the following year. The plain had gone pale and still by then, the long grasses flattened under frost. the sky holding a low, colourless light that Hyperion carried without warmth across his arc. The cold was not harsh. It was simply present, the way all things in the Golden Age were present, abundantly, without apology, filling the world with whatever quality the season required. Rhea laboured in the same chambers, the same morning hours, the same quality of deep, quiet pressing against the walls. Kronos sat outside the room and listened to nothing, because there was nothing to hear except the faint sounds of the world turning in its frost. When the child arrived, he heard it briefly. Hades did not cry for long. It was a very short sound, small and clear as a bell struck once in an empty room. Then it stopped, and the silence afterward was so complete that Kronos felt it press against his chest with a particular weight he had not anticipated. He rose and went to the doorway. Rhea was lying with the child against her, one hand curved around the infant's back in the way her hands had always curved, with a natural sureness, acclaiming. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. She did not look away from him as she had with Demeter, as she had adjusted herself to do with Hera. She held his gaze across the room with something clear and flat and unsurprised in her face. She did not ask him to wait. She did not ask for a single day. She simply looked at him, and then she looked down at the child once, with the particular attention of someone fixing a thing in memory. And then she looked up again. She held Hades out to him. Her arms extended across the space between them with the steadiness of someone who had made their decision alone, long before this moment, and was now only following through on what had already been resolved. Her hands were steady. They did not shake. This was not practiced composure, as it had been with Hera. It was something further along. Something that had moved past practice into a kind of stone. Kronos crossed the room. He received the child. He left. When he returned, the room was exactly as it had been. Rhea lay in the same position. Her arms had folded back against herself, the curve of them still holding the shape of what they had released. She was looking at the ceiling. Not at the doorway, as she had looked after Hestia, not at the floor, as she had sat after Demeter. At the ceiling, as though there were something there worth reading, some notation she had not previously noticed. He sat beside her in the cold morning. Neither spoke. Outside, the frost held the plain in its white stillness. The world asked nothing of this particular morning. It simply turned, generously, in the way the Golden Age had always turned, offering its abundance regardless of what occurred inside the chambers of those who ruled it. The bronze of aftermath had been present since Hestia. Kronos understood that now, sitting in the winter quiet. What had begun as something sharp had slowly changed quality, not softened, that was not the right word. Changed, as bronze changes under continued pressure, not breaking, but recording the pressure in its grain, holding the memory of every force that had been applied to it. He found himself, in the cold stillness of that morning, moving backward through the seasons in his mind. He remembered the years before the births, the early years of their rule, when the Golden Age was simply the world as it was, unhurried, full, asking nothing difficult of anyone who walked within it. He remembered the particular quality of those years, the way time had moved differently, slowly, without the weight of accumulation, without the shape that anticipation and loss give to the passing of days. He remembered Rhea in those early years. Her face had held a different quality then. Not innocent, she was a Titan, ancient and fully made, but open in a way that carried no defense within it. The openness of someone who has not yet been asked to protect themselves against the very things they love. He had known her before. The prophecy had changed him. He remembered that too. The Kronos who had stood in the early light of the first years. Beside Rhea on the long plain with its deep grasses moving in the slow wind, had not yet learned to hold everything at a careful distance, had not yet understood that the prophecy meant distance was the only remaining instrument available to him. He had simply stood there beside her, the plains spreading in every direction under the generous sky, and it had seemed that this was what ruling the world looked like, simply this. Two titans standing in long grass, with the abundance of the golden age unrolling around them in every direction, he had not known. Then, that knowing a thing is coming does not prepare you for the individual weight of each particular instance of it arriving. Poseidon came in the spring. The world bloomed with the same effortless excess it had always offered in spring. The plain went from pale to green in the course of days, and the warmth returned under Hyperion's longer arc, and the earth gave its abundance freely as it had always given. Rhea did not go to the chambers willingly this time. She walked through the house with a deliberateness that Kronos recognized as the outer form of an interior resistance she had chosen not to voice, not because it would change anything. She understood that, but because the body retains its own objections even when the mind has completed its accommodation. She labored. The morning came. Poseidon was a large child, and louder than Hades had been. His cry filled the room with a fullness that was startling after the quiet of the winter birth. It was a wide, uncontained sound, like something that expected to take up space in the world and had arrived already prepared to do so. Rhea held him. She did not look at Kronos when he appeared in the doorway. She looked at the child. She held this one with the particular intensity of someone spending something they know they cannot recover, moving slowly and deliberately through each moment of it. Then she lifted her face. Her eyes met his across the room. In them was something he had not seen before in any of the previous losses. Not grief, not the stone she had become by Hades, something older than either. Something that looked at him and recognized fully what he was, what he had done, what he continued to do, and held all of it in a single clear gaze without looking away. She held Poseidon out. Her hands released him into Kronos' arms with the careful deliberateness of someone laying down something irreplaceable with full knowledge of its irreplaceability. Kronos took the child and left the room. The spring air was warm on his face as he moved through the corridor. Outside, the plain was impossibly green. Somewhere distant, water moved through new grass with the unhurried sound of the season doing its work. When he came back, Rhea was at the open window, not looking out. Her head was bowed. Her hands rested on the window-sill with their palms turned upward, open, as though she had set down everything they had been asked to carry and had not yet decided whether to close them again. He stood in the doorway. The bar of pale morning light lay across the floor between them. He did not cross it. She did not turn. Outside. The world continued in its generosity, indifferent and complete, the spring plain holding its deep colour under the wide and open sky. That morning did not end. It simply extended itself, the way certain mornings do, spreading outward from its centre without releasing anyone standing within it. Hyperion moved across his arc above, and the light in the room shifted its angle by degrees, and still Rhea stood at the open window with her palms turned upward on the sill. And still Kronos remained in the doorway, and the bar of pale light between them stretched and thinned as the hours accumulated. At last she closed her hands. Not quickly. She brought her fingers in slowly, the way one closes around water knowing most of it will pass through regardless. Then she turned from the window, and she looked at him directly, and what was in her face now was neither grief nor stone nor the clear recognition he had seen when she lifted Poseidon toward him. What was there now was something that had moved through all of those things and come out the other side into a quieter country. She said nothing. She crossed the room past him, her shoulder nearly brushing the door-frame, and he heard her footsteps recede down the corridor with that same deliberate pace she had used when walking to the chamber at the beginning of her labour. A walk that kept its form from long practice, that carried nothing extra. The corridor fell quiet. He remained in the doorway a long time after. Outside, the green plain breathed in the spring warmth. Somewhere a bird was moving through the upper air, its shadow crossing the pale stone of the courtyard below, and the world continued to present itself in its full abundance, as though the years of accumulation inside these walls had not changed anything fundamental about the way light fell on grass or water moved between its banks. He understood, standing there, that something had been completed. Not resolved, not mended. Completed, the way a series completes itself, not by arriving at harmony, but by arriving at its final term, 5 children swallowed. 5 acts of the same necessary thing, each one different in its particulars, the cold morning, the winter cry, the spring fullness. The particular angle of Rhea's face in each instance, and yet forming, in retrospect, a single long shape. He did not follow her. The days that followed were different, not dramatically so. The plane continued its spring business. The household moved through its ordinary hours. Rhea was present at meals, present in the long evenings when the warmth held past sunset and the air carried the faint sound of distant water. But something in her bearing had shifted so completely that the shift itself was no longer visible. She had settled into the new arrangement of herself, as a landscape settles after a change in geology, not showing the earthquake any more, only its result. She stopped leaving the window of her room open at night. He noticed this small thing in the way one notices small things after large ones have passed, with a clarity that does not extend to understanding. Then she began making preparations. He saw the signs before he fully read them. A particular quality of attention she brought to certain conversations that had not been there before. The careful way she asked the household about routes between places, distances, how long a journey would take across certain terrain, the way her gaze, when she thought he was not observing, went to the middle distance with an intentness that was not grief and not memory but planning. Rhea was thinking about Crete. He knew this without having been told. Gaia had spoken to her. He understood this too, with the certainty of someone who has spent long enough beside another person to read the invisible grammar of their changed attention. His mother, ancient and deep, had reached toward Rhea in the way Gaia reached toward those she wished to move, not in dramatic appearance, but in the slow way knowledge enters a person who has prepared themselves to receive it. Gaia had given her counsel, and the counsel had a destination, and the destination was an island far to the south across the wide water, where caves opened into mountains and wild Cretan goats moved through sage and thyme on slopes that had never heard the Titan's voice. He did not confront her with it. He was not certain why, perhaps because confronting it would require him to decide what to do about it, and he found that he did not know. Perhaps because some part of him, wearing thin against the accumulated bronze of 5 completed losses, had arrived at a place where the prospect of her resistance no longer felt like threat, but like something older and more fundamental, like the prophecy itself, like Gaia's ancient patience, like the way the earth does not argue with the river but simply receives it and is changed. She moved through the following weeks with the quietness of settled purpose. He watched her, and she let herself be watched, and neither of them named what was being watched. The spring deepened into summer. The plain lost its sharp new green and settled into the denser colour of full growth. Hyperion's arc stayed high and long. The evenings came later, and the air thickened with warmth, and the smell of turned earth from the farms that stretched in every direction from the palace grounds. She began to gather things, small things, cloth, provisions that she kept with a discretion that was not quite concealment. She did not hide what she was doing, but she did not present it either. She moved through her preparations in the same careful, unhurried way she had held each child before releasing them, spending each action fully, letting nothing go to waste. On a morning in late summer, she came to stand in the doorway of the room where he sat. The light was behind her. He could not see her face clearly, only her outline, and the particular way she was holding herself upright with a stillness that was not tension but completion. She told him she would be going south. that she would cross the water to Crete before the child came. She did not ask his permission. Her voice carried no question. She said the words with the plainness of someone stating a fact about the physical world, a distance, a direction, a season. He sat with what she had said. Outside, the summer plain lay flat and golden under Hyperion's long light. The familiar grasses moved in the small wind that came each afternoon from the southwest, the same wind that had moved them since the beginning of the Golden Age, the same wind that had moved them when they stood together before any of this had begun. Before the prophecy had made of him what it had made, and of her what it had made, and of the space between them what it had made, he did not say yes. He did not say no. He sat in the long light and looked at her outline in the doorway, and somewhere outside a bird crossed the courtyard shadow on its way to wherever the afternoon was taking it, and Rhea, without waiting any longer for a word from him, simply turned and went back down the corridor. Her footsteps were steady. They diminished evenly, and then they were gone, and the doorway held only summer light. Kronos remained in the room for a long time after her footsteps had gone. He did not follow her. He did not call out. He sat with his hands open on his knees, the way a man sits when he has finished making something and is uncertain whether it will hold. And outside the southwest wind moved the summer grasses, and the courtyard lay empty and still in the broad afternoon light. She had not taken everything with her yet. That would come later. The small bundles of cloth, the provisions, the things she had gathered across those long weeks of preparation, those remained. She would leave with the morning, or the morning after. He did not know exactly when. She had not said exactly when. He found he did not need to know. This was a new thing, not knowing something and not reaching after it. The not knowing sat in him like a stone placed gently on a smooth floor, settled and quiet. He looked at it. He did not pick it up. The days that followed had a strange, held quality. She moved through the palace with the same settled bearing, finishing what remained of her preparations. He passed her in corridors. They spoke when speaking was necessary. There was no coldness between them, and no warmth of the old kind either. What remained was something else, something more like the air before a storm that has already been decided. Not yet arrived, but certain. The pressure already changed, the light already different. She departed on a morning when Hyperion had barely cleared the eastern ridgeline. Kronos stood at the window of the room where he most often sat in the mornings. The plain below was still silvered with the particular light that comes before the sun has fully committed itself to the day. He watched the figures moving below, her attendants, the small procession of what she was carrying south. He watched until the road curved where the old olive trees stood, and they passed behind the trees and were gone. Then he turned back into the room, and the morning went on without her in it. The days that followed grew shorter. Hyperion's arc began its slow descent back toward autumn. The light shifted by degrees, the gold of summer acquiring a thinner quality, and the morning air carried something it had not carried before, a faint sharpness underneath the warmth. He thought about the stone. He had not known exactly that this was what he was doing until he found himself seated at the long table in the hall one evening and realized that his thoughts had been on nothing else for some time. He thought about the stone the way one thinks about a door that stands closed in a familiar corridor, knowing the room behind it, knowing its dimensions. A stone wrapped in cloth. Presented in the way she had presented each child before, he had felt the difference and swallowed it anyway. No, that was not quite true. He had not felt a difference. That was the precise and uncomfortable truth of it. He had taken what she gave him with his eyes open and his hands certain, and he had brought it to his lips, and he had swallowed it down, and there had been no pause in him. No hesitation, no moment when the body understood before the mind did that something was other than what it appeared to be. The weight had been right. The warmth had been right. The cloth had been right. She had known exactly how to make it right. He sat with this for a long time in the empty hall. Outside, a wind moved through the courtyard, not the familiar afternoon wind from the southwest. This one came from the northwest, carrying the first faint cold that announced summer's end, moving low across the flagstones the way water moves across stone, finding every hollow. He had swallowed the stone. He had swallowed it completely, trusting what his hands told him, trusting what his mouth told him, and the child he had swallowed was not a child, but the weight of Gaia's ancient knowledge, pressed and shaped and wrapped in cloth, and offered back to him in the precise form that his own long habit of fear had prepared him to receive. He understood this the way he understood other large things, not all at once, but in stages, each stage arriving with a quietness that was almost gentle. The sixth child was alive. Somewhere south across the dark water, on the island where caves opened into mountains and wild goats moved through sage and thyme, on slopes that had never held his voice, the sixth child was alive and breathing and beyond his reach. He sat with this for so long that the hall grew dark. No one came to light the lamps. Perhaps they had learned, in the way that people who live near great power learn, to read the quality of silence in a room and let certain silences alone. He was not angry. This surprised him. He examined the absence of anger and found something more unsettling beneath it. Not grief, not quite. Something that had the shape of recognition. The prophecy, after all, had never asked for his belief. It had simply waited, the way mountains wait, the way Gaia waited, with no need of his acknowledgement in order to go on being true. He had taken every measure available to him. He had swallowed 5. He had managed the world with a careful hand. He had watched Rhea's face across years and seasons and meals and silences, and he had seen everything she permitted him to see, and apparently she had permitted him to see exactly what she chose to. That, too, was something. He rose from the table and walked to the doorway of the hall and stood there looking out at the courtyard. The northwest wind had settled. The flagstones lay pale and still in the thin light that remained. A single bird had landed near the far wall and stood there, and after a moment it lifted and crossed the shadow of the colonnade and disappeared over the roofline. The same courtyard. A different season. The stone was at Delphi now, or it would be. He understood this with the same quiet certainty he had come to understand other things he had not been present to witness. Someone would carry it there. It would be set in a particular place. It would be called the navel of the world. The thing he had swallowed, the centre of everything, made sacred by the very act of his swallowing it. He remained in the doorway until the last light left the courtyard entirely. Then he went inside, and the palace settled around him. And the night came on, and somewhere across the wide southern water, on a dark mountain full of the sounds of goats and wind and hidden water, a child he had never seen drew breath in a cave that smelled of stone and thyme. The cave on Crete had no name that season. It sat in a fold of the mountain, deep in the limestone, where the rock curved inward and the air stayed cool even through the long, dry months. The entrance faced northeast, and in the mornings a thin light fell across the stone floor at an angle that changed by small degrees each day. Outside, the slope fell away through scrub oak and sage toward a valley below. Wild goats moved along the ridgeline at dawn and again at dusk. The sound of hidden water came up from somewhere beneath the rock, a low, continuous murmur that had been there long before any living thing came to shelter in that place. Amalthea knew the cave. She had known it the way that certain creatures know certain places, not through discovery but through belonging. She was a nymph of that mountain, and the mountain's particulars were part of her in the way that the smell of thyme was part of the air, present and unremarkable and entirely necessary. She moved through the cave's interior without hesitation, navigating the low places and the wider chambers with the ease of long familiarity. When the infant arrived, she received him without surprise, as though the cave itself had been waiting in its patient, mineral way, and she had simply been part of what it was waiting with. The child was small. This was the first thing she noted, and then she stopped noting it, because smallness in a newborn was ordinary, and there was nothing else ordinary in this particular situation. She fed him from her own abundance. She was a goat in that aspect, or she was a nymph who could be a goat when the need required it, and the distinction mattered less on that mountain than it might have elsewhere. The child fed, and grew warm, and made the sounds that new things make, and the cave held all of it, and the sounds did not carry beyond the stone. This was, in the first days, the primary concern. The Courettes understood this. They were young men of the mountain, armoured in their own way, wearing bronze that caught whatever light reached them, and they stationed themselves at intervals along the slope below the cave entrance. When the child cried, which he did with the unambiguous intensity of any infant who has been born and finds the world loud and cold and strange, they beat their shields together, bronze against bronze. A ringing that spread across the hillside and filled the spaces between the rocks and the scrub oak and the goat paths, a sound large enough to swallow smaller sounds entirely. The rhythm of it was not martial. It was something else. Closer to music than to war, though it used the instruments of war to make itself. The Courettes moved as they played, circling, shifting, keeping the sound continuous and mobile, so that no single direction seemed its origin. They had done this before in other contexts for other purposes. They knew how to make noise into a kind of shelter. On the slope below, goats paused and then continued grazing. The child in the cave heard the bronze, faintly as a vibration in the stone more than a sound in the air. He felt it the way the mountain felt it, without interpretation, without fear. Amalthea watched him closely in those first weeks. She watched his hands, which moved through the air above him with a loose, exploratory quality, fingers spreading and closing on nothing. She watched his eyes, which were dark at first, as new eyes are, and which tracked light when light was available. She watched him sleep and noted the depth of it, the way his whole body participated in sleeping, each small limb going fully still, as though sleep were not a suspension of activity, but an activity in itself. She fed him honey along with milk. The honey came from bees that worked the thyme flowers on the southern-facing slopes. And it had a particular quality to it, warm-scented and faintly resinous, carrying something of the mountain's character in its sweetness. She offered it on a fingertip, and the child took it without hesitation. Later, in the way that histories arrange their details, it would be said that honey was his first food, and this was not entirely wrong. Outside the cave, the season moved as seasons do. The light changed on the slope in ways that Amalthea recognized and attended to. The angle of morning light across the cave floor shifted by small degrees. The goats moved to different grazing ground as the lower plants dried out and the higher altitude scrub stayed green longer. The hidden water beneath the rock kept its temperature, kept its sound, indifferent to the calendar. The Courettes adapted their patterns. As the child grew stronger and his crying became less frequent, they relaxed their formation. They still came when needed. They still moved along the slope with their bronze, ready to fill the air with sound at the first signal. But there were long stretches of quiet in which they simply sat at their posts and watched the valley below and the sky above, and the mountain was as still as any mountain. Amalthea noticed that the child began to watch the light, not with the unfocused tracking of the very new. With something more directed, he would follow the bar of morning light as it moved across the floor, turning his head slowly, staying with it. When she held him near the cave entrance, and the outside air came in carrying the smell of sage and rock and the remote sweetness of thyme, he stilled completely. His hands stopped their movement. He seemed to be receiving something. She did not name this quality in him. She had no reason to name it. She only noted it and held him carefully, and understood that the work of these months was not simply keeping him alive. It was keeping him whole. The cave received this work without comment. The stone absorbed the small sounds of feeding and sleeping, and the occasional bronze ringing from the slope. It absorbed the footsteps of Amalthea moving between the entrance and the interior chambers. It absorbed the low vibration of the hidden water and the distant calling of birds along the ridgeline. Far to the north, beyond the water that separated island from mainland, a palace sat on an elevated plain where olive trees lined the roads. A hall stood empty and unlighted. A figure had gone inside as darkness came, and the northwest wind moved low across flagstones. The child in the cave did not know this. He knew the warmth of Amalthea's hold, the smell of her which was mountain and milk, and the faint mineral tang of the rock she moved through. The vibration of bronze, when it came, arriving through stone before arriving through air. He grew. Each morning the light fell at a slightly different angle across the floor. The curetas on the slope shifted their weight and watched the valley. Amalthea brought honey on her fingertip, and the child opened toward it, and outside the cave the goats moved along the ridge-line in the thin early light, and the hidden water ran on beneath the rock. And the mountain held all of it with the same steady, unremarkable patience that mountains have always brought to the work of holding things. Years passed in the cave, the way years pass in places that do not count them. The morning light continued its slow migration across the stone floor. The hidden water ran on beneath the rock. The child grew into a boy, and the boy grew into something that Amalthea watched with a different quality of attention than she had given the infant. She watched him stand at the cave entrance for long spans of time, looking down the slope toward the valley. She watched the way he moved through the interior chambers, touching the walls with an open palm, learning the temperature of the stone in different seasons. She watched his hands, which no longer moved through empty air but reached for things, found things, carried things back. The curets noticed the change also. They adjusted, the way practitioners of any discipline adjust when the task itself transforms. The bronze came less often now. The child's cries had long since ceased to require covering. What the curets offered instead was presence. They ranged the slope with a quieter purpose, watching. Available, their bronze at rest on their backs like tools carried between uses. The boy absorbed the mountain. This was how Amalthea thought of it. Not that he learned it, not that he studied it, but that something passed from the rock and the water and the high ridge-line into him. The way resin passes into honey, slowly, without declaration. He ate the honey still. She brought it to him on a fingertip when she wished to show him something, a plant, an insect, a shift in the light, and he would turn toward her with the same immediate attention he had shown as an infant. This did not change. Some things about him did not change. But years are not kind to stasis. What had been concealment became, in time, preparation. The cave that had kept him whole now grew small around him, the way all first places eventually do. Mettie found him when he was ready to be found. She came from the sea winds that crossed the island in the long months, one of the elder Oceanids, a daughter of Tethys and Okeanos, whose name meant counsel, the way some names mean only themselves. She carried knowledge the way water carries salt. It was simply present in her, dissolved and inseparable. She came to the cave in the early evening, when the northeast entrance faced away from the last light and the interior was cool and still. Amalthea received her without surprise. Some arrivals do not surprise those who have been watching the slope. Mettie spoke plainly. There was a plan. There was a potion. There was a return that must be made. Zeus listened. He had heard his own history, of course. Amalthea had not withheld it from him. He knew about the swallowing. He knew about the stone in cloth, and his mother's journey to this island, and the curetes on the slope with their bronze. He knew the palace to the north, where his father paced the olive-lined roads and an empty hall received only wind. To know a thing and to face it are different labours. Mettie explained the potion, an emetic drawn from particular herbs that she named carefully, mixed with water from a clear source, sweetened with something palatable, administered without declaration. She did not call it deception. She called it precision. Zeus considered the plan for several evenings. He sat at the cave entrance as he had stood in childhood, looking down toward the valley, and the valley gave him nothing in return except its own steady presence. The goats moved along the ridgeline at dusk. The hidden water ran beneath him, too far down to hear but present in the faint coolness that rose through the rock. He agreed. Amalthea watched him prepare to leave. She watched his face, which was settled, and his hands, which were still, and she understood that the work she had done in this cave was complete. He went north with Metis beside him. The crossing was nothing particular. Water, and then a shore that was different from the shore he had left. The mainland rose from the coast in long slopes of dry grass and limestone, different in character from the island, but made of the same general patience. He walked the olive tree-lined roads toward the elevated plain with the careful attention of someone entering a room whose dimensions he cannot yet fully see. The palace was as he had imagined it, and not larger, perhaps, more silent than he had expected. The flagstones of the outer court were worn in the paths that long use wears into stone, and the olive trees along the road moved very slightly in a wind that did not reach the ground. He entered under a name that was not his own. This was Metis' work, the disguise, the manner, the approach. He carried the potion in a vessel of plain clay, nothing notable about it. Metis had tasted it herself and found it adequate, not painful in the taking. Simply present, working in time, Kronos was in the great hall. He sat at the far end, at a table of dark wood, and the hall was lit by oil lamps at intervals along the walls. He looked, at that distance, like what he was, a king who had ruled for a very long time. The weight of it sat on him not as collapse, but as compression. He had grown denser with it. His face, when Zeus drew close enough to see it, held the particular stillness of those who have spent long years watching doorways for what they fear. He noticed the visitor without alarm. Zeus was offered a cup. He received it. The potion was in the clay vessel he had carried, and in the moments that followed, in the ordinary movements of hospitality. Of cups filled and set before guests, of wine brought to the table, the potion entered Kronos' drink. This was the confrontation. Not thunder, not a declaration of names. A cup set on dark wood, a drink accepted. Kronos lifted it and drank, because he had done so countless times in that hall, because the habit of years makes its own path, because the silence around him had offered no reason to pause. Zeus watched from across the table. He watched his father's face as the drink went down. He watched the stillness that followed, which was the ordinary stillness of a man who has just swallowed something unremarkable. The lamps moved their small light along the walls. Outside, the northwest wind came low across the plain and found the flagstones of the outer court and moved on. Then Kronos' hand moved to the table's edge. Not dramatically, the way a hand moves when the body beneath it has been quietly disturbed. His other hand followed. His face changed in the way faces change when something inside them is changing, the expression arriving before the understanding of what it means. Zeus did not speak. Metis had advised against speaking. The thing now occurring required no narration. It would unfold according to the properties of the herb and the body of a Titan and the years of what that body had held inside it. Kronos looked across the table. For a moment, in the lamplight, his eyes found the face of his guest and held it. And something in them shifted, the way the morning light in the cave had shifted by small daily degrees, accumulating into change so gradual it could not be marked except in retrospect. He did not yet know what he was looking at, but he would. The hall received this moment, as halls receive all moments, with the patient indifference of stone. A lamp guttered on the far wall and steadied. Outside the palace, the olive trees along the road stood motionless in the dark, and the wind that had crossed the flagstones moved on into the plain, and the plain accepted it without record. The thing unfolded in silence. Kronos' hands pressed against the dark wood of the table, and the pressure in them was not the pressure of a man bracing against pain. It was something older and less nameable. His body had recognized something that his mind had not yet formed into knowledge, and this recognition moved through him the way pressure moves through rock, not quickly. but with absolute certainty of effect. Zeus remained seated across the table. The oil lamps burned at their intervals along the walls. The light they gave was warm and insufficient, adequate for the business of a hall, but not for the full illumination of faces. Zeus watched his father with the stillness Metis had taught him in the days before the crossing, the stillness of observation without reaction, of waiting without visible waiting. Kronos set down his cup. The sound it made against the dark wood was small. A click, no more. Around it the hall held its considerable silence. The servants who had brought the wine had withdrawn. There were only 2 figures at the long table, and the lamps, and the northwest wind outside finding no entrance in the stones. Then Kronos's body began to work against itself. It was not immediate. The herb Meti had selected was deliberate in its action, respectful in a sense of time. And what moved through the Titan King's body moved the way groundwater moves through limestone, present and insistent and unhurried. His face tightened. His jaw set. One hand gripped the table's edge with a force that was not directed anywhere in particular, simply released into the nearest available surface. Zeus watched. He had been told what would come next. Meti had described it plainly, without ceremony, the way she described most things. The body holds what has been placed in it. The herb asks the body to release what it holds. The body eventually obeys. She had said this as a fact of matter, not a cause for feeling. Kronos rose from his chair, not with intention, with the involuntary authority of a body overriding its occupant. He was tall in the lamplight, broader than Zeus had expected at close distance, with the compressed density of his long years built into the set of his shoulders and the slow deliberateness of his movements. He moved to the side of the hall, away from the table, one hand trailing the wall. What came first was the stone. It struck the floor of the hall with a sound unlike anything else in the hall's long history of sounds, a blunt, dense impact, stone on flagstone, 2 kinds of patience meeting each other hard. The omphalos. The wrapped stone Rhea had placed in cloth and handed to Kronos instead of her last child, the stone that had lived inside the Titan King for the years of Zeus's entire life on Crete. Swallowed in the same moment, and by the same motion that should have received a god. It lay on the flagstones and was still. Zeus looked at it from across the hall. He had heard of it from Metis, from Rhea, from Gaia's distant tellings that arrived in dreams on the island. Here was the thing that had stood in his place, heavy and indifferent, serving its function without understanding it had one. Then Poseidon, not a stone, but a god fully formed, arriving from within Kronos with the startled force of something that had been held and compressed and now was not. He stood in the lamp-lit hall, gathering the fact of himself after years of dark and stillness, his presence immediate and physical and enormous. He looked at the hall. He looked at his hands. He did not speak yet. He was still assembling what speaking meant. Then Hades, more contained in his arrival than Poseidon. He stood where he came to stand, and he was quiet, with the quality of someone for whom quiet is a natural condition and not a constraint. His eyes adjusted to the lamplight with patience. He looked at the stone on the floor. He looked at Zeus across the hall, and his expression held a recognition that did not require words, because recognition of this kind is prior to words. Then Hera. She arrived with the manner of someone who had been waiting, not with resignation but with intention, and her first act was to straighten, a long, deliberate motion, claiming the full height of herself in the room. She took in the hall without sentiment. Her gaze moved to Zeus and held there for a moment, measuring. Then Demeter. Her emergence carried something gentler in its manner. More attentive to the surfaces around her, the floor and the walls and the lamps and the quality of the air, she placed one hand flat against the wall and held it there, as though confirming the texture of stone. Then Hestia. She was last, and she arrived with a completeness that the others, absorbed in the immediate fact of themselves, did not notice at once. She stood in the centre of the hall, equidistant from all its walls, and she looked at nothing in particular with an attention that seemed nevertheless total. The lamps nearest her burned very steadily in the moment she arrived, without flickering, as though something had settled in the air around them. Kronos was on his knees near the wall. The effort had moved through him and left him diminished in the way that great expenditures leave their host, not broken but emptied. He remained with one hand against the stone floor, and his breathing came in long, slow measures. He was still a Titan. That had not changed. The substance of him was unchanged. But the hall was different now, populated with what his body had concealed, and the difference was enormous and unmistakable. Zeus crossed the hall to his siblings. There was no ceremony in this, no announcement. He moved through the lamplight, and he came to stand among them, and they were a group in a way that none of them had any previous experience of being, because they had never before occupied the same space at the same time. Not in the world above the stone they had been held within. Poseidon put a hand on Zeus's shoulder. Once, then removed it. That was sufficient. Hades looked once more at the Omphalos stone where it rested on the flagstones. He said nothing about it. There was nothing to say. It was an object that had served a specific purpose in a specific moment and would now serve another, and this transition required no commentary. Kronos lifted his eyes from the floor, across the distance of the hall. His gaze found the 6 of them standing together in the lamplight, and what crossed his face was not grief exactly, not rage. Something that had no single name, the expression of a man seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, the full shape of what the fear had made him do. The prophecy had told him a child would bring his end. He had swallowed 5 children to prevent it. He had swallowed a stone in place of the 6th, and here, in his own hall, lit by the same lamps that had witnessed his long solitary years of watching doorways, was the exact thing he had worked across decades to prevent. Not because it could not be prevented, because the attempting of prevention had made it inevitable. Outside, the northwest wind moved across the elevated plain, low and steady. The olive trees along the road held their positions in the dark. The flagstones of the outer court received the wind and released it. The plain received it in turn. The Omphalos stone rested on the floor of the hall, cooling slowly. Heavier by itself than anything else in the room, waiting with the particular patience of objects whose meaning has been decided by events they did not choose. No one spoke. The hall held the 6 of them, and Kronos, and the stone, and the lamps burned without commentary on any of it. The northwest wind pressed against the outer walls with the same low pressure it had maintained since nightfall, finding nothing to enter, finding nothing changed. Hestia had not moved from the centre of the hall. She stood with her feet placed evenly on the flagstones, and her hands at her sides, and her attention directed at nothing and everything with equal measure. Of all of them, she seemed the least startled by the fact of herself. She seemed, if anything, to have been expecting this exact room for a very long time, and to find it adequate. Kronos watched them from the wall. He did not rise. The effort of rising was available to him. He was still a Titan, and the substance of a Titan does not deplete, but rising required a decision about what came next, and he had not arrived at that decision. He remained with his hand flat against the floor. The stone floor was cold beneath his palm. He noticed this. The cold was a specific, manageable fact in a moment that contained very few manageable facts. Across the hall, Demeter had moved away from the wall where she had first placed her hand. She walked the perimeter of the room with small, deliberate steps, her attention moving from the floor to the lamps, to the table, to the cups, to the flagstones under her feet. She did not appear to be searching for anything. She appeared to be taking inventory of the world, confirming, surface by surface, that it existed, that it had texture and weight, and the faint smell of oil smoke from the lamps. Hera watched Demeter for a moment without moving, then turned back to the centre of the hall. Her gaze eventually came to rest on the Omphalos stone. It lay where it had fallen, on the flagstones between Kronos and his children. Its cloth wrapping still partially intact, the pale fabric loose now, folded back, the stone's grey surface exposed to the lamplight. It was not a remarkable object by appearance. Dense and round and roughly worked, the size of a man's doubled fists. Nothing about it suggested what it had been. Nothing, except that no one in the hall could stop regarding it. Hades crouched beside it. He rested his forearms on his knees and studied the stone without touching it, the way one studies something whose meaning has finished changing but whose presence remains complicated. He could see the cloth clearly. He could see the careful folds Rhea had made, the cloth brought tightly in at one end, loosely at the other. Arranged with the deliberate precision of a woman who needed a god to believe what he was holding was not a stone. The belief had held. For years beyond counting in that interior dark, the belief had held. Hades looked at the cloth for a long time. Then he stood, and moved back to where Poseidon and Zeus stood together near the centre of the room. Zeus had not looked away from Kronos since the 6 of them had gathered. His attention was steady and without particular expression, neither triumphant nor merciful, simply present. The way a completed thing is present once it has completed. Kronos felt this attention without meeting it directly. He understood what it represented. He had spent years attempting to ensure this moment never arrived, and his failure was now standing in his own hall, using his own lamplight to illuminate itself, and this was the nature of the prophecy's fulfillment, not arriving as a catastrophe from outside. But as a result grown from inside, from his own acts, from his own swallowing, and his own hall, and his own long years of preventive watching, the fear had not protected him. The fear had built the very structure through which the outcome moved. He knew this now with the clarity that arrives only after the fact, never before it. The lamps along the walls continued their small, steady work. Outside, the olive trees stood in the dark. The road was empty. The outer court received the wind, and the wind moved through without finding purpose. Poseidon turned from the group and crossed to the long table. He picked up one of the cups there, turned it in his hands, and set it back down. The gesture was not about the cup, it was about having hands, and having something to put them on, and the simple fact of both these things being available. He remained at the table for a moment with his palms flat on the dark wood, feeling the grain of it. Hera moved to the cup beside the one Poseidon had touched, and did not pick it up. She stood near it. The 6 of them occupied the hall in a loose arrangement that was not quite a circle and not quite a line, distributed through the room according to no plan, according only to where each of them had come to stand and had remained. They did not form a unit yet. They were, individually, each still assembling what they were, gods emerging into the fact of themselves after the long, dark interior years, and the process of assembly was quiet and slow and required no witness. Kronos was the witness anyway. From the wall he watched each of them. He watched Hestia's stillness at the centre of the room. He watched Demeter's careful survey of the surfaces. He watched Hades's gravity, and Hera's precise self-containment, and Poseidon's hands on the table, and Zeus standing in the lamplight with that steady, completed attention. He had done this to them. He had held them in the dark to prevent exactly what they now were. He had swallowed the thing he feared and discovered that the swallowing preserved it perfectly, kept it intact and growing in the dark, until the hour arrived when it would emerge unchanged. The prophecy had not been a warning. It had been a description. At some point during the night, without announcement, Hades lifted the omphalos stone from the floor. He held it with both hands, the cloth wrapped loosely around it, its weight settling into his grip. He crossed the hall and set it on the table. The stone touched the dark wood with a sound that was lower and more final than its size suggested, a single dense contact, brief, resolving. He stepped back. The stone sat on the table beside the cups, occupying its portion of the available surface with the absolute indifference of an object that has survived its own significance and arrived on the far side of it. It would not remain in this hall. Everyone in the room understood this without discussing it. The stone had been created for one purpose, to replace a god in a Titan's swallowing, and that purpose was finished. What the stone would become next was something else, an object carried carefully from this elevated hall on the plain of Crete, placed eventually on the road that moved westward and south, carried across the sea to Pytho, to the rocky slopes below the mountain where the oracle spoke, where it would be set into the earth as the navel of the world, the sacred center, marked by the stone that had survived the body of Kronos, not despite what it had passed through, but because of it. The hall was quiet. The lamps gave their steady light. Kronos remained against the wall, and his children remained in the hall around him, and the stone rested on the table between all of them, cooling still. Dense and round and grey, asking nothing of anyone, containing the residue of its long dark years, waiting with the particular patience of an object that has already done the one irreplaceable thing it was made to do. The stone sat on the table, and no one moved toward it. Kronos watched this. He watched each of his children hold their position in the hall, the loose arrangement of their bodies unchanged, each one still occupied with the quiet work of assembling what they were. None of them spoke. None of them looked at the stone with any urgency. They had all, in their separate ways, already understood what the stone represented, and that understanding required nothing further from them tonight. Outside, the northwest wind continued its work against the outer walls. It had been pressing there since nightfall. It found no entry. The stone hall held its shape. Kronos felt the floor beneath his palm. Cold flagstone, consistent. It had been his anchor since he sat down against the wall, and it remained his anchor now, the grain of the stone. The small irregularities in the surface, the temperature of a floor that had absorbed no warmth since the hall was built. He had ruled a cosmos once. He had held the sky in his authority, and watched the golden age spread outward across the world below. He had walked in full knowledge that the earth feared him, and the seas obeyed the general order of things, and the order was his. That was finished. He understood this without distress, or rather with a kind of distress that had passed through its own crisis and emerged on the far side of it, where the body of it was no longer breaking, but only sitting still and very heavy. The Titan's composure was intact. What sat beneath it was another matter. Zeus had not looked away from him. This was a particular kind of attention, and Kronos had been receiving it since Zeus first crossed the hall and stood in the lamplight, steady, unhurried, the attention of a thing that has arrived at its destination and is now simply present there. Kronos knew this quality of attention. He had possessed it once himself, after the sickle, after the throne, after the first certainty of power settled into him and became ordinary. That settled quality, Zeus had it now. It had moved between them then, from father to son. The way that things moved in prophecy, not taken exactly, but transferred according to a mechanism older than taking. Demeter completed another slow circuit of the hall's perimeter. Her hands were at her sides. She looked at each surface she passed, the walls, the lamp brackets, the long seams in the flagstone floor, with a steady attention that resembled accounting more than curiosity. She was learning the hall. She was learning all the particular surfaces of the world that had existed while she was not in it, and there were many of these surfaces. And the learning would take time. Poseidon had not moved from the table. His palms were still flat on the dark wood. He stood with his shoulders down and his weight settled, and every few minutes he shifted his hands slightly without lifting them, a slow quarter turn, adjusting his contact with the grain of the wood. He was doing what all of them were doing in his own way, establishing contact with the world that had remained outside the dark. Hades stood near the table, 2 paces back from the stone. He was looking at it with an expression that held no particular affect, simply looking at it, the way he had been since placing it there, attending to its presence. Hestia had not moved from the centre of the hall. She stood with her feet even and her hands at her sides. She was the still point around which the others arranged themselves without knowing it, and she made no attempt to draw attention to this, and her stillness was complete and unconcerned. Hera stood near the table's edge, near the cup she had not picked up. Her self-containment was precise and absolute. She missed nothing in the room. She watched each of her siblings with the same quality of attention she gave the walls, cataloguing, weighing, filing the information away in some interior space that was already, even tonight, already beginning to organize itself into authority. Kronos watched all of this. He had made each of them. He had held each of them in the dark, inside himself, for years beyond the counting of mortal time. He had swallowed the thing he feared, and the thing he feared had grown regardless, grown in the dark the way things grow in the dark, without light, without space, without permission. This was the nature of the outcome. The war had not yet come. He knew it was coming. He could feel it in the hall the way he felt the floor beneath his palm, not as an abstraction, but as a fact already present, already waiting to begin. Zeus had not come here to end things quietly. The 6 of them standing in this hall were not the resolution. They were the condition preceding resolution, and the resolution would be long, and it would shake the foundations of Othris and Olympus both, and it would reorder everything, absolutely everything, that Kronos had built and held and watched. The Titans would not yield without the full cost of it. He would not yield without the full cost of it. He understood this, too, with the same quiet clarity he had understood the prophecy. The pattern was not obscure. The next thing was already indicated by the present thing, the way each act had been indicated by the act before it, the sickle indicating the throne indicating the swallowing indicating the stone in swaddling cloth, the stone indicating the emetic indicating this hall. This night, these 6, this cold floor under his palm, and this hall, this night, these 6, indicating what came next. The lamps continued their work. The oil smoke was faint and steady. The stone sat on the table and did not move. Kronos looked at the stone for a long time. It was dense and grey and roughly worked, and it had survived the interior of a Titan, and it would be carried to Pytho, and it would become the sacred centre of the world, and none of this was his to hold or prevent or alter. The stone had passed through him and arrived at its next destination. His children had passed through him and arrived at theirs. The prophecy had passed through him and arrived at its completion, which was not an ending but a transition from one order to the next. From Titan rule to what the 6 of them standing in this hall would build after the war, he moved his palm across the flagstone. A small adjustment. The cold was consistent. The grain of the stone was rough and fine in alternation, the way all stone is rough and fine in alternation. Zeus was still looking at him. Kronos did not rise. He remained seated against the wall in the lamplight with his hand flat on the floor, and outside the wind continued against the walls of the hall, and the stone sat on the table with the pale cloth folded back from it, and his 6 children stood distributed in the space between. Assembling what they were, quietly, without urgency, in the long hours of the night that had not yet indicated it was ending. Demeter moved first. She had been standing near the far wall since the beginning, her hands at her sides, and now she crossed the hall in a few unhurried steps and stopped beside the table. She did not reach for the stone. She stood near it, close enough that she could have touched it, and looked at the grain of the dark wood instead, the long parallel lines of it, the small knots and interruptions, the places where the grain curved around something dense inside the wood. Poseidon watched her do this without shifting his own hands. Demeter placed one palm flat on the wood beside Poseidon's. She did not look at him. She looked at her own hand resting there, and at the wood beneath it, and she held that contact with a steadiness that was different from Poseidon's. His was a broad, grounded pressure, weight distributed evenly. Hers was more particular, a careful attention to the specific surface, the way she had always attended to surfaces, to the condition of things under her hands. Kronos watched her place her palm down. He had swallowed her second. After Hestia. She had arrived from Rhea already small and already particular and already attending to small things. He did not know this as a memory exactly. He knew it as a quality. The quality of what she had been inside the dark had left something in him, the way objects leave impressions in soft ground. All 5 of them had left their impressions. Zeus moved. Not across the hall. He took 2 steps toward Kronos and then stopped. He stood in the lamplight at a distance that was neither close nor far, and he looked at his father with the same steady attention he had maintained since arriving. He had not softened it. He had not increased it. It was a fixed thing, that gaze. And it told Kronos nothing about what the boy intended beyond the fact of his continued arrival, that he had come here and was here and intended to remain. Kronos held the gaze. Outside, the wind shifted, not diminished, only changed direction by a few degrees, so that it pressed against a different angle of the outer wall. The sound of it altered slightly, lower, then steadied again into the long, consistent pressure that had defined the night. Hades turned his head toward the window. He stood 2 paces from the stone, attending to its presence, and now he attended to the window instead, the narrow opening high in the wall that had let in no light since before the lamps were lit. The darkness outside was full and unvaried. He looked at it with the same expression he gave the stone. Not blank, not empty, but attending, taking in the fact of what was there without requiring it to be otherwise. Kronos looked at his son, looking at the dark window. The war would come to Hades in a specific way. Not first. He would not bear the first weight of it. But the end game of the war would belong to him in a way it would not belong to the others. He would descend again into the dark, but by choice. And the darkness he was given would be immeasurable and absolute, and it would be his to govern. The helm of darkness. The deep kingdom. The charge of all the dead across all time. Kronos did not feel pity for this. He felt something closer to recognition. The dark he had carried his children in and the dark Hades would rule were not the same dark, but they shared a quality. They were both places where things persisted without light, without the usual accounting of the world. Hestia had not moved. She stood at the center of the hall with her feet even and her hands at her sides, and the lamps burned steadily near her, and their light fell on her the way it fell on the walls, without preference. Without meaning, simply falling where it fell. Kronos had always found her the hardest to think about. Not because she grieved him, because she didn't. She was the first he swallowed, the first to know that interior. And she had emerged tonight and placed herself at the hall's center and stood without complaint or question or evident feeling about any of it. And this equanimity was not absence. It was deep and deliberate and rooted in something he could not quite locate. She knew something. He suspected she had always known it, from the first hour of her existence, a knowledge so fundamental it had no use for language or expression. Hera set down the cup. She had held it for a long time without drinking from it, and now she placed it on the table without ceremony, near the stone, and withdrew her hand. She looked at the stone. Then she looked at Kronos. Her look was different from Zeus's. Zeus looked at him with attention. Hera looked at him with assessment, a careful measurement of a thing she intended to account for fully, to never be surprised by again. He recognized this quality in her. He had spent decades assessing his father's actions for patterns, for indicators of what Uranos would do next, what he would allow, what he would prevent. Hera had learned a version of this practice from the inside of Kronos himself, or she had arrived in the world with the capacity for it, and the dark had simply given her the time and the necessity to develop it. She would be formidable. He knew this sitting against the cold wall. Whatever structure she would build within the new order, it would be precisely constructed and exactly maintained. Zeus had taken another step. He was closer now, not threatening, not urgent. One step, and then he had stopped again, and his feet were planted on the flagstone, and he was looking at his father with that same unflinching steadiness. The lamplight caught one side of his face, the other fell into shadow. Kronos thought, here is the one the prophecy indicated, not as a reckoning. As a fact, the same order of fact as the grain of the floor under his palm, the cold of the stone, the steady movement of oil smoke toward the ceiling. The prophecy had said his own child. His own child was standing here in the lamplight, having administered the emetic, having gathered the siblings, having come to this hall and stood in it through the long hours with that particular quality of attendance. Zeus had not come here to gloat. He had come here because this hall was the place the night indicated, and he had followed the indication. The same way Kronos had once followed the cold weight of the sickle out of Gaia's hands, one generation following what the last generation started. The 6 of them in this hall, they were what he had carried and prevented and failed to prevent. And the war was ahead of them all, 10 years of it, the earth cracking and the sea boiling in its basin, and the sky filling with thunder before the real rain came. The sky absolutely full of it, the kind of held-breath silence preceding the collision of 2 forces that had been moving toward each other since the first act of the first night. Kronos pressed his palm flat against the flagstone. The cold was the same. The grain was the same. Nothing in the floor had changed since he first sat here, and nothing would change when he rose. The floor held its cold with great consistency, the way old things hold their character, not through effort, but through accumulated duration. Zeus stood in the lamplight, looking at him, and Kronos, seated against the stone wall with his palm on the floor of a hall that the wind could not enter, met his son's gaze with the same settled steadiness, not surrender. Not preparation, not anything that resembled either of those things, simply presence. The last of the night's long hours moving through them both, unhurried, in the slow-burning lamplight. While outside the wind held its angle against the wall, and the oil smoke moved in its thin, consistent line toward the dark ceiling above, the night did not move. That was the quality of it. Outside, the wind continued its steady pressure against the outer wall, and the lamps burned their slow, consistent burn, and the oil smoke rose in its thin lines, and nothing in the hall changed except the quality of the silence, which had been deepening for some time now, the way water deepens without visible motion. Kronos looked at his son. Zeus remained where he had stopped, 1 foot slightly forward on the flagstone, the lamplight dividing his face into its 2 familiar territories, light on the left, shadow on the right. He was not impatient. He had the quality of someone who understood that certain things could not be hurried, and had no particular desire to hurry them. This patience was not a performance. Kronos recognized it as structural. It was how Zeus was built. Poseidon had shifted, not far. A small adjustment of his weight from 1 foot to the other, almost imperceptible, the kind of movement a body makes when it has been standing in one place long enough to feel the flagstone's particular firmness. His hands remained near the table. 1 finger rested against the dark wood. Demeter's palm was still flat on the table surface. She had not looked at the stone. She had looked at Kronos, then at the table grain, then back at some middle distance that existed for her and not for anyone else in the room. Her expression had not changed through any of it. She had the quality of someone who was holding a great deal very still inside herself, not suppressing it, but simply containing it with the practiced ease of long habit. The 10 years were still ahead. Kronos held this fact in his mind the way he had held the cold of the flagstone under his palm. It was true. It was coming. The forces had been in motion since the emetic worked, and the stone was the first thing he vomited, and then each sibling had come after it in their order, fully grown, unchanged, carrying inside them whatever the dark interior had taught them during their long residence. They had emerged here. They were standing here, and the war that would follow their emergence had not yet begun, but was as certain as the grain in the table's wood. 10 years. The earth cracking under the weight of it. the sea driven back from its usual edges, the sky so full of concussions that the ground would answer with its own shaking. He had known this was coming, not in the way a man knows an appointment, in the way a stone knows the river that has been moving around it for 1,000 years, not knowledge as thought, but as condition. The prophecy had come from Kronos, who spoke it with a wound still open, and from Gaia, who spoke it with the long patience of someone who had already seen the end of every story she had ever told. Kronos had received their words and had acted on them as though acting could redirect the current, swallowing each child as it came. Feeling the prophecy solidify rather than dissolve with each act, he thought of Rhea. She was not in this hall. She had not been in this hall through any of the long hours. Where she was now, Kronos did not know with certainty. Somewhere in the world that was still intact outside these walls, where the wind moved and the dark was the full, uninterrupted dark of open sky above the hills. Rhea, who had given each child into his hands and watched him swallow them and carried the weight of that in her face through years of it. Rhea, who had finally stopped giving them to him at all. Who had gone to the island and come back with a cloth-wrapped stone and watched him swallow that instead. He had swallowed it. He had felt nothing different. The stone settled in him the way the others had, or had seemed to. He had felt the weight of it and been satisfied by the weight, and Rhea had stood before him with her face arranged into an expression of grief, convincing enough that he had not looked for the other thing underneath it. There had been something underneath it. He understood this now. Seated against the cold wall with his 6 children standing in the lamplight, the grief had been genuine. The relief under it had also been genuine. Both things had been true at the same time in her face, and he had read only the one he expected to find. Hades had turned slightly from the high narrow window. His face in profile now showed something that was not quite attention and not quite absence, a kind of held consideration, as though he were listening to something that existed at a frequency the room did not fully carry. He had the quality of someone who was already comfortable with very long waits. Whatever the underworld would ask of him, the dark inside Kronos had prepared him for duration. He would not find the deep places difficult. He would find them familiar. This Kronos also held without judgment, only with recognition. He had been the one who created the conditions of that preparation, however inadvertently. Whatever Hades carried into the underworld's governance, the steadiness, the patience with long silence, the willingness to remain in the place where others would not go, it had been incubated in the dark interior of his father's body. This was not a thing Kronos felt pride about. It was a thing he recognized. The dark he had imposed had produced something durable. Whether this was consequence or compensation, he could not say. Zeus took one more step. He was close now, 4 or 5 paces. Still deliberate, still unhurried. The lamplight caught more of him at this distance, the set of his jaw, the particular stillness of his eyes, the way his shoulders carried their certainty without tension. He was not wearing it like a declaration. He carried it the way the floor carried its cold, inherently, without needing to make a point of it. Kronos looked at his son and did not look away. Outside, the wind shifted, a very small shift in direction, no more than a few degrees. The pressure against the outer wall changed its character slightly, became a fraction more direct, not stronger, simply more present. The lamp flames adjusted without going out, bending their small angles and returning. The smoke lines wavered and straightened. Kronos noticed this. He noticed it the way he had been noticing the small movements of the hall for hours, the cup Hera set down, the incremental approach of Zeus. Poseidon's quiet shift of weight, the smoke finding its line again after disturbance. He had been watching all of it without interpretation, simply receiving the information the room offered him. He was still the same creature he had been when he took the sickle from Gaia's hands. He understood this without regret and without absolution. He had been made a certain way. He had acted as he was made to act. The prophecy had told him what was coming, and he had tried to prevent it with the tools available to him, and those tools had been inadequate, and here was the result, his 6 children in the lamplight. And the war still ahead, and himself on the floor of a stone hall, with one palm pressed flat against the cold and consistent flagstone, one generation handing the next its consequences. And Hestia still at the hall centre, still unmoving, her feet even on the stone floor, and her hands at her sides, and the lamplight falling on her without preference, without meaning, knowing whatever she had always known, holding it in that deep, deliberate, rooted way that had no use for expression. The night continued, unhurried, moving through them all without distinction, the way the dark outside moved over the hills, over whatever land lay between here and the sea, over the sea itself, neither faster nor slower over any of it, simply moving, simply passing at its own consistent rate through the last of these hours before the long war that was already decided, in all the ways that matter, before the first stone was thrown. Demeter's palm remained flat on the table. She had not moved it for a long time. The grain of the dark wood ran beneath her fingers in long parallel lines, and she was aware of them, the way one becomes aware of texture after holding still long enough, not as something noticed freshly, but as something that had been there all along and had only now come into full registration, her hand against the wood against the table's frame, the table standing on the cold flagstone that Kronos could feel beneath his own palm across the room. He was watching her without directing his gaze at her particularly. She was simply one part of the hall. His attention moved across without urgency, the way the dark outside moved across whatever it moved across. Demeter was the one he had held the longest. This was a fact he had considered before, and was considering again now, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of steady acknowledgement. 5 children inside him at once, and she had been among the first, Hestia before her, and then Demeter, and then Hera, and then the 2 who had gone into the dark already knowing something about long patience. He had held all of them in a dark that was his own body's making. He had not known during those years what was accumulating inside him. A father assumes, in the act of holding, that he understands what is held. He had assumed this. The weight had been familiar, each child a settled fact inside him, the prophecy's teeth blunted by what felt like completion. He had carried them and called it prevention, and believed the name he gave it. What he had actually done was different. He understood this with the clarity of a man who has had sufficient stillness to examine a thing without the pressure of urgency around it, the stillness Tartarus would eventually give him. The stillness the hall was giving him now, prematurely, as though the stone walls had decided to offer him a preview of that long dark in advance. He had taken 5 lives and kept them in suspension. Not ended, not free. Suspended. And the dark inside him had done what dark does when life is placed within it and left there long enough. It had shaped them, each one differently, according to what they already were. Hestia had come out knowing how to be still. She was demonstrating this now, standing at the centre of the hall with a quality of presence that was not performance and not resignation. She was simply there, fully there, as though being completely present in one place required no effort, because effort implied there might be somewhere else she would rather be, and there was not. She had learned this in the dark, or she had brought it into the dark already, and the dark had confirmed it. He could not tell which. Demeter's palm pressed the table surface. Her fingers had curled very slightly, not a fist, not a grip. Simply the natural small movement of a hand that has been still for a long while and is adjusting itself without meaning to. The lamplight fell across her knuckles and found the wood grain beneath them, and Kronos watched the lamp smoke drift upward in its thin line and hold. He thought about the sickle. Not often. In these hours. He had thought of it earlier, and thought of his mother's hands presenting it to him with the careful neutrality of someone offering a choice while making clear there was only one acceptable answer. He had taken it. He had been the only one willing, 4 brothers who looked at Gaia's proposition and found reasons to decline, and one youngest son who had looked at the same proposition and understood it differently. He had always been good at understanding what was being asked of him. This was not pride. Sitting against the cold wall with his children in the lamplight, it was simply an observation about what he was. He had understood Gaia's need and acted on it. He had understood the prophecy's warning and acted on it. He had understood Rhea's grief and read it partially and acted on that partial reading. He had understood at every juncture what was being asked and had done the thing that seemed to answer the asking. And the understanding had been right each time in the narrow sense and wrong each time in the larger one. The sickle had freed the Titans and freed Gaia and produced. From the same act, the Erinyes in the earth's dark places and Aphrodite from the pale sea foam, creation and consequence arriving together. He had held the instrument and not been able to separate what the instrument would make from what it would unmake. No one had warned him this was how causation worked. Or perhaps Uranos had warned him in that final moment. Uranos, whose body had been the instrument's target, who had spoken the prophecy in something that was not quite a curse and not quite a gift, a knowledge delivered from a position of complete helplessness to a son who had not yet learned to fear what complete helplessness felt like. He knew now. Zeus was 4 or 5 paces away. Still standing with that unhurried certainty, the lamplight halving his face with its particular indifference to symbolism. Left side lit. Right side in shadow. He was looking at Kronos with an expression that was not triumph and not sympathy, something more neutral than either. Recognition, possibly. Acknowledgement of a fact that did not require commentary. Kronos received this without looking away. The smoke line wavered. The lamp flame bent slightly to one side and then corrected itself, and the smoke resumed its vertical path with the consistency of something that has no investment in any particular direction but simply rises because rising is what it does. Outside, the wind was steady again after its small shift. The pressure against the stone was even, uniform, not building toward anything, simply present. A constant that would continue through the remaining hours of this night and into the hours after, moving over the hills and over the water without preference or destination. Poseidon's finger rested on the dark wood of the table. One finger. Lightly. His eyes were directed somewhere between the table's surface and the middle distance, not focused on the grain the way Demeter's seemed to be, not directed at Kronos or at Zeus. Simply resting in the space the hall provided. He was the one among them who had gone in already carrying some knowledge of what large, indifferent forces felt like, the sea's patience. Its bottomless capacity for holding things in suspension without dissolving them. He had carried that into the dark, and the dark had not frightened him with it. Had simply confirmed it. Another consequence Kronos had not calculated. He was finished calculating. This was one of the things the stillness of the hall had settled in him over these hours, the recognition that calculation had brought him here, to this floor, with this palm flat on this cold stone, and that the calculation had been as complete as he had been capable of making it, and it had ended here regardless, one generation. Its particular tools, the consequences of those tools. And then the next generation standing in the lamplight with their own tools, which they had made partly from what he had given them, and partly from what they had taken for themselves in the dark. Hestia's feet remained even on the floor. She was not watching him, and not watching him. She was simply present at the center of the room, holding the air around her with a quality of consistency that the lamplight treated the same way it treated the walls, as background, as the condition within which other things occurred. The night moved through all of them equally. Kronos felt the cold of the flagstone travel up through the bones of his hand. Slow and even and certain, the way cold moves through stone when it has had sufficient time and no resistance. He did not resist it. He let it be there. He let the hall be what it was around him, its lamps, its smoke. Its 6 figures in various arrangements of stillness, its dark wood table with its long grain lines running their parallel courses from one end to the other. Whatever came next had already been decided. He understood this the way he understood the smoke lines, not as a source of comfort, not as a source of grief, simply as information the room had been offering him all night, and which he had received with the full and quiet attention of someone who has finally run out of reasons to refuse it. Zeus moved first, not toward Kronos, not away. He simply shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the smallest possible adjustment, and the lamplight across his face changed in consequence, the line between lit and shadow relocating a few degrees toward his chin and then settling again. The hall absorbed the movement without comment. The smoke rose. The wind pressed against the outer stone. Kronos watched this and said nothing. There was nothing that required saying. The hall had known this for hours, had been holding the fact of it in its walls and its floor and its cold, still air, and Kronos had finally caught up to what the hall knew. Words were tools the way the sickle had been a tool. They made things and unmade things simultaneously, and he was finished with the making and the unmaking. He was content, if content was the right word for it, to simply be in the room, to let the room be complete without his contribution to it. Hera stood near the far wall. She had been there for some time, close enough to the stone that the lamplight barely reached her. Not hidden, simply at the room's edge, holding her place with the particular self-containment of someone who had learned early that occupying the margins was not the same as being marginal. She had come out of him. This was among the facts the hall contained, and she had grown into something he had not designed and could not have predicted. Something with its own preferences, its own grievances, its own considerable capacity for will. He had not taught her these things. She had arrived at them by other routes. He was aware of her in the way he was aware of all of them. Steadily, without reaching. Demeter's fingers had not moved from their slightly curled position on the dark wood. Her attention remained on the grain of the table, or on something below the grain, something the wood surface gave her an excuse to look toward without requiring her to name it. She was the one among them most legibly marked by what she had come out of, the dark, the enclosure, the long interior waiting. Her domain was things that came up from the earth after being held within it. Kronos had not done this intentionally. He had swallowed her to keep her. The earth had turned the keeping into a vocabulary she could use. This was among the consequences he had not calculated. The cold in his palm had reached the wrist now, slow, even. The stone giving what it had to give at the rate it gave it. He did not pull his hand away. Somewhere in the succession of hours he had stopped thinking about what Tartarus would feel like and had started simply inhabiting this room. Not as a reprieve, not as a delay. As what it was, a present moment in a hall with 6 other figures and 4 oil lamps, and a table made of dark wood and a floor made of cold flat stone. He was here. This was the full extent of the fact. It did not need augmenting. The pardon, when it came, would arrive the way everything arrived. He had not been thinking about it. It had floated up through the other thoughts the way smoke floated up through air, not because it was seeking anything, but because it had nowhere else to go. Pindar had written of it in the way that singers write of things whose truth they cannot quite verify, but whose rightness they feel in the phrasing. A release from Tartarus. A quiet assignment at the far edge of the world. The Isles of the Blessed, where the heroic dead arrived to find their rest, and where a ruler was required, someone who knew the full length of consequence and had come out the other side of it. Emptied of urgency, capable of a long and unwavering patience. Kronos did not know if this was true. He knew that it had the right shape, that the shape of it matched something he had noticed about how cycles completed themselves, not always in destruction, not always in the clean severance the sickle implied, but sometimes in the quieter movement of a thing returning to an earlier arrangement by a longer road, the Golden Age. The ease of it. The abundance. He had been its custodian once, in a world that did not yet know how long the road from abundance to enclosure could be. Perhaps there was a version of that stewardship still available to him. Stripped of the fear that had made it into something else, perhaps the Isles of the Blessed needed what he had become. A ruler with no more calculations left to make, no prophecies to outrun. Only the long familiar work of holding a place steady while the souls of heroes arrived and found their rest in it. Zeus shifted again. The same small movement. Wait to wait. Kronos looked at him. Zeus looked back. The expression on Zeus's face had not changed, that neutral acknowledgement, the recognition of fact without commentary. But there was something else now, faint enough that it might have been a trick of the lamplight, which was always rearranging the faces of things into configurations they had not chosen. Something that was not yet forgiveness, and not yet the absence of it, a door not opened and not closed. It was enough to notice, no more than that. The smoke line rose. It bent slightly where some movement of air had disturbed it, a variation too small to feel, too present to ignore, and then the line resumed its vertical course, thin, patient, indifferent to being watched. Kronos had watched it all night, the way he had watched everything in this hall, not to extract meaning from it, but because it was there and watching was what his eyes were doing, and the watching itself was a form of the quiet he had arrived at, after the sickle, after the swallowing. After the war and the long dark of Tartarus and the cold floor of this hall with its 6 other figures and its 4 burning lamps. This was what remained when the calculation was exhausted. A room. A table with long grain lines, cold moving through a palm. 6 people who had come out of him or out of his refusal. He could not cleanly separate the 2 any more, standing in lamplight, breathing, present, their own. Hestia stood at the centre and held the air around her even. Outside, the wind moved over hills and water. Steady, uniform. Carrying nothing in particular toward nothing in particular, only moving because moving was what it did in the hours before the darkness changed. Kronos let his eyes close. Not in defeat, not in surrender. In the plain and ordinary acknowledgement that the eyelids are heavy after a long night, and closing them is the thing the body does when it has finished with watching and is prepared at last. For whatever the next hour brings, the darkness in the hall was changing, not with light yet. No light had come, but there was something different in the quality of the air that had nothing to do with the lamps, which burned at the same steady rate they had burned all night. The walls knew it before the figures standing between them did. The stone floor knew it. The long grain of the dark wood table ran in the same direction it had always run, and yet the surface looked subtler now, cooler. More itself. Kronos breathed. His eyes remained closed. The cold had moved past the wrist and now occupied the forearm in a slow and uniform distribution. He had been aware of this without attending to it, the way one is aware of one's own breathing without directing it. It was happening. It did not require his participation beyond his willingness to remain still. Rhea was not in this hall. She had not been in any hall where Kronos had found himself in recent memory, and yet she was present in the way that people who have made a permanent impression on a place are always present in that place. She had stood in rooms like this one. She had placed her hands on tables like this one. She had watched him from across distances similar to this one. The expression she would have worn was not entirely lost to him. He could still recall it with a specificity that surprised him. The particular angle of her head when she was deciding how much of what she knew to give voice to, how often she had chosen silence. How much the silence had contained. He had not known when they were young together, and the golden age was still simply the world they moved through without naming, that what they were building was a memory, that all of it, the ease, the grain abundance, the long unhurried days, would one day require recalling rather than inhabiting. You do not know you are in a time worth remembering until you are standing some far distance from it, looking back. He had loved her. This was the fact that survived all the others. Not perfectly, not well, at the end. But the original substance of the thing had been genuine, and the original substance did not disappear simply because it was later buried under fear and refusal and consequence. It remained somewhere in the record, the way the first mark made on stone remains under every mark made after it. Rhea had been the person beside him when the world was still only possibility. She deserved to be named in any honest accounting of who he had been. Demeter's fingers moved, a slight uncurling against the grain of the table. Not waking, she was already awake. Simply releasing something she had been holding without realizing she held it. Kronos noticed this without opening his eyes. He was not certain how he knew, some awareness below the threshold of sight. The particular texture of the room's silence had shifted by a small amount, and the shift was Demeter. She was still attending to the wood grain, most likely, still directing her gaze downward, but the hand had opened slightly. That was new. He thought of the earth she governed, the specific language she had developed for return, the ground going soft in certain months, the green ascending through dark soil, the whole cycling insistence of it. He had not given her that language. She had made it herself out of materials he had accidentally provided by keeping her where roots keep themselves, below, in the close dark, in the unlit places where things wait for the right conditions to rise. This was among the unexpected inheritances he carried now, the knowledge that what he had intended as ending had become, for each of them, a particular form of beginning. Hestia had not moved. She remained at the center of the room with the same composed steadiness she had held all night. The air around her was as it had been, even undisturbed, tended without visible effort. This was her nature rather than her performance of her nature, and Kronos recognized the distinction because he had spent too many years performing what he could not manage to embody. Hestia had never performed anything. She simply was what she was, entirely, without remainder. It occurred to him that this too had come from somewhere before him. From Rhea, who had known how to be still with a completeness he had never achieved. He could see the inheritance clearly now, the line running from Rhea to Hestia through some quality of inner steadiness that neither the darkness nor the years had diminished. Outside, the wind continued, the same hills, the same water. The darkness above them held the hour before any brightness changes it, and the wind moved through that darkness without urgency, encountering each hill and continuing past it, encountering each surface of water and crossing without incident, carrying nothing specific, going nowhere specific, simply moving because the world requires that air move through it, because stillness absolute is not a condition the living world sustains. Gaia was in all of it. She was always in all of it. She had been the first fact. Before Ouranos spread himself above her, before the Titans were born from their pairing, before the sickle and the prophecy and the long sequence of cause upon consequence, there had been Gaia. Ancient, slow, attentive in the particular way that things attentive over immeasurable spans of time grow attentive. She had watched all of this unfold from her own surface. She had been its surface. She was the floor beneath the cold stone floor. She was the ground beneath the hills the wind moved over. She had loved her children and been failed by them and gone on tending the world regardless, because tending was not a response to being treated well, but a fact of her nature, inseparable from what she was. Kronos had come from her. He returned to this now, in the last dark before morning. He had come from her, and the sickle she had made for him had been an act of love as much as strategy. She had believed in his willingness to act when the others had refused. She had not been wrong about his willingness, only about what it would eventually produce. She had wanted liberation. He had produced one cage in exchange for another. She had watched this from her surface too. The smoke line rose. It rose without deviation now. Whatever slight movement had bent it earlier had stilled. The line was perfectly vertical, delicate, rising from the lamp to the unseen ceiling in a continuous unbroken thread. Kronos considered the Isles of the Blessed. He considered them without desire, which was new. Not resignation, something more clear than that. The Isles, if Pindar's sense of the thing was sound, required a ruler who could sit with a great deal of history and not flinch from it. Who could tend a place of rest without being consumed by what rest had cost him to arrive at? He did not know if he was that yet. He knew he was closer to it than he had ever been while the calculations were still running, a ruler with no further prophecies to manage. Only the long, still work of being present for those who arrived. Zeus did not move. The lamplight held the line of his face steady, the division of shadow and brightness where it had been all night. Not forgiveness, not its absence. A door with the latch neither thrown nor held. This was how the cycles completed themselves sometimes, not in any single declared moment, but in the accumulated hours of a night spent in the same room, breathing the same air, saying nothing, requiring nothing of each other except presence. Kronos had been in the first sky before any of this began, before the sickle, before the swallowing, before the long dark of Tartarus and the longer road back. He had been there when the cosmos was only Gaia and the sky above her, and everything that would come was still coiled inside the possibility of what two ancient things might make together when they turned toward each other. This tale has been told countless times, and each telling finds something the previous telling left in the shadow. That is the particular gift of myth, not the answer folded at its center, but the better question that the telling opens. If these long hours found you here at the end, something in the story held you, and that matters. Take a moment to like and subscribe if these nights at Olympus Dreams have become part of your own quiet hours. And leave a word in the comments that you were here. It always means something to know who stayed. The darkness held. Outside, the wind moved over the hills. Somewhere beneath the cold stone floor, Gaia turned. As she had turned at the beginning, patient and vast, carrying every name the world had ever given itself.